The cabin air crackled with tension as every eye swung toward row 16. Maxwell Carter's hand shook on his phone. Zoe Carter's knuckles pressing into his forearm so hard that half-moon imprints bloomed on his skin. Sandra, the flight attendant with a crisp navy uniform and a name tag gleaming under the overhead lights, stood before them. Her professional smile had snapped into a tight, accusing line. The jet's twin turbofan engines idled at barely 20 miles per hour on the tarmac. But in that moment, the small space between their row felt as wide as an ocean of prejudice. With steady calm that belied the storm inside, Maxwell cleared his throat and spoke into the handset. "Yes, Captain Andrews. This is First Officer Maxwell Carter on Flight 2187 to Atlanta. I need to report an incident of discrimination by one of your flight attendants." His voice cut through the hush, carrying the authority of a man who had overcome every obstacle to reach this point. Passengers froze mid-breath. Even the low hum of the APU seemed to fade away as Sandra's cheeks flamed crimson. No one aboard Flight 2187 that morning could have predicted how a simple seat switch request would unravel every layer of privilege and bias on board. Before the confrontation in row 16, Maxwell had woken just after dawn to the comforting scent of freshly brewed Colombian roast. At 39, after 15 dedicated years at Carter, Johnson & Carter Architects in Chicago, he had finally earned the title of partner. Across his sleek condo living room, Zoe, 34 and 5 years his junior, leaned against the doorframe, mug in hand, her eyes alight with pride. "You're humming," Zoe teased, taking a deliberate sip of her coffee. "It has nothing to do with telling Dad the firm is now Carter, Johnson & Carter." Maxwell zipped his carry-on closed and grinned. "Maybe a little." He glanced out the window at the parking lot where their black SUV waited. "Car will be here in 15. You ready?" Zoe set her mug down with a gentle clink. "I am, but there's something I need to tell you." She paused, inhaling. "I've been offered a full professorship at Emory, heading their Center for Racial Justice Studies." Maxwell froze mid-zip, a rush of exhilaration and concern mingling in his chest. "Zoe, that is incredible. Emory." He stepped forward and pulled her into a fierce hug. "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you." She laughed against his shoulder. "Mom and Dad will be over the moon." Their parents' sacrifices had paved every inch of their journey. Their father, who spent 4 decades delivering mail rain or shine, and their mother, an elementary school teacher who clutched lesson plans between caring for them, had given up vacations, late nights, and every spare penny so Maxwell and Zoe could build dreams they'd once thought impossible. The drive to O'Hare was a warm conversation spattered with memories. "Remember that old station wagon Dad drove?" Zoe asked. "I was so embarrassed." "That car paid for your SAT prep and my architecture camp," Maxwell reminded her. She smiled wistfully. "I know. He taught me books are the one thing no one can take away." At the terminal, they wove through the rush with practiced ease. Zoe's quick hands gathered bins for security while Maxwell trailed, grateful for her calm efficiency. At the gate, they treated themselves to lemon muffins dusted with sugar crystals. When Maxwell returned, he found Zoe deep in discussion with an elderly gentleman. "This is my brother, Maxwell," she said, introducing him with the ease of a seasoned host. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending a gnarled hand. "Sophia Elizabeth arrived yesterday, my first great-granddaughter." Maxwell shook his hand, genuine warmth in his smile. Boarding call crackled through the speakers, and Zoe nudged Maxwell. "Row 16, seats C and D." They slipped into their seats, she by the window, he wedged between 2 muted strangers, just as a commotion erupted near the front. A blonde woman in designer layers gestured wildly, her voice threaded with impatience. Zoe arched an eyebrow. "Looks like our flight just got interesting." Moments later, Sandra reappeared with the woman in tow. "Mr. and Ms. Carter," she said, voice smooth but eyes cold. "Ms. Carrington missed her upgrade and needs an aisle seat. Would one of you mind moving to seat 28B?" Maxwell's gaze flicked to the first-class cabin, where a well-dressed man thumbed through his phone without a care in the world. "Her husband is in first class?" he asked quietly. Sandra's tight smile wavered. Yes, but there are no more open seats up there. Zoe straightened, her scholarly poise sharpening into resolve. We booked these together for family reasons, she said softly but firmly. Maxwell rested his hand on her arm, a silent show of solidarity. Why us? He asked. There must be other solo travelers behind us. Sandra's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I selected you first, she admitted, annoyance flickering across her features. If you are unwilling to help, I will ask someone else. Silence surged through the aisle as Sandra turned to leave. But before she could even take a step, Maxwell lifted a single finger and locked eyes with her. Time seemed to pause in that narrow corridor, every passenger holding their breath for what would come next. The moment Ms. Carrington spoke, her words cut through the thrum of boarding like a blade. I paid full price for my ticket, and it's not my fault the airline overbooked, she snapped, voice sharp enough to crack china. Her glare skimmed past us, landing on Maxwell and me as if our skin alone disqualified us from basic courtesy. I felt my stomach twist. She'd just called us these people, as though our very presence was a stain on her travel plans. Sandra's posture stiffened beside her, as though rewarding that slur, and I knew we were in for the long haul. A hush washed over row 16. I caught Maxwell's eye. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He's 6'2" in dress shoes, broad-shouldered, and yet every time he tries to rise in anger, some invisible leash yanks him back. I felt that same tug at my chest, the memory of every time a stranger assumed my worth or potential based on my skin. The sting of lessons in code switching handed down like a family heirloom. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice even. These people, I repeated softly, watching Ms. Carrington's face darken. And who might that be exactly? Ms. Carrington's hand trembled on the armrest. I simply meant passengers who booked together, she stammered, the merciless sheen in her eyes barely hidden. Obviously. I leaned forward, tone gentle but unyielding. Obviously, we booked together. We're siblings traveling home for a family celebration. You asking us to move feels personal. Behind her, Sandra cleared her throat, stepping closer. Perhaps we can find another solution, Sandra offered, voice syrupy. If you'll follow me. No, Ms. Carrington cut in, too quick by half. I've been a platinum member for 15 years. I am not taking a back row seat when there are perfectly good seats available right here. She jabbed a finger at Maxwell. You move. Maxwell rose before I could stop him, gathering his things. I'll move, he said quietly. Beneath his calm, though, I heard the edge of a chainsaw. Mal, no, I whispered, hand on his arm. You don't have to. He paused, towering over both women in the aisle. It's not worth the fight, he began, voice low. But I'd like to speak with the captain first. Sandra's blue eyes narrowed. The captain's busy with pre-flight checks. Is there something I can help you with? Maxwell's words were crisp, measured. It's regarding airline policy on seating and potential discrimination. The word hung in the stale air like an accusation, and Sandra's professional mask cracked. Before she could reply, a new voice cut in, smooth and unflappable. I'd be happy to switch seats. Heads turned to see Harold Maxwell standing there, the same kindly older gentleman who'd saved us earlier. His eyes were bright, his posture erect. I'm in 28B and don't mind moving up here. You two should stay together, especially for a family event. Relief flickered across Sandra's face. That would be perfect, sir, she said. Ms. Carrington, however, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. She glowered from Harold to the empty seat beside us. That's kind, she bit out. But I need the aisle. I have a medical condition that requires frequent trips to the lavatory. Harold's grin never faltered. Well, I'm a window man myself. Always have been. I love watching the sky. I'll take the middle seat. Outmaneuvered, Ms. Carrington finally nodded and took her place. For a moment, the tension eased. Harold settled in between us with a contented sigh. Lovely to continue our chat, he said to me, as though nothing at all had happened. He asked about my research, and I answered reluctantly, every polite word edged with fatigue. Sandra retreated to help other passengers, and I exchanged a look with Maxwell over Harold's head. We'd navigated another microaggression, diffused another affront, but something about today felt different, more poisonous. Just minutes before, we'd been celebrating family triumphs. Now, our homecoming was tainted by the reminder that no amount of success or partnership could shield us from prejudice. As the cabin crew resumed their checks, sanity seemed restored, until Sandra reappeared, this time with Jasmine, a younger flight attendant whose name tag read like a promise. "Excuse me," Sandra said, voice tight. "There's another issue. We need one of you to move after all." I stared in disbelief. "We already resolved this," Harold ventured. I switched seats to help. Sandra's lips thinned. "Ms. Carrington needs to be seated with her husband for medical reasons." She pointed to a man now standing in the aisle, Mr. Carrington himself, freshly arrived from first class. The absurdity hung so heavy even the overhead bins seemed to sag. I opened my mouth, but Maxwell spoke first. "This is ridiculous. First you ask us to separate for an upgrade mistake. Then you ask again for medical reasons you never mentioned." His voice shook with controlled rage. Mr. Carrington cleared his throat. "I wasn't informed until the captain told me." Maxwell's eyebrows shot up. "Then the captain knew about it but refused to speak with me." Heads turned as though the plane itself were leaning in. Sandra's face paled. Jasmine shifted on her feet, unease flickering in her eyes. Ms. Carrington's cheeks burned a matching crimson. Nobody looked eager to address the mounting chaos. Sandra swallowed and squared her shoulders. "Either you or your sister relocate now, or we involve security." The implicit threat was clear. Resistance would mark us as troublemakers. I felt the heat rise in my neck, the all-too-familiar squeeze of anger I'd learned to stifle since childhood. Maxwell's hand curled into a fist at his side, but he kept his voice measured. Before he could respond, Harold stood again, his cane tapping lightly on the linoleum aisle. "I'd like to speak with the captain myself," he announced. Sandra's jaw dropped. "Sir, you need to remain seated during taxi." Harold's gaze was unwavering. "Then I suggest you stop the plane, because what I'm witnessing looks like discriminatory treatment, and as a former civil rights attorney, I intend to pursue it." The cabin fell silent. Seats creaked, breathing stilled, and even the engines seemed to hold their roar. Sandra's composure slipped. Jasmine's hand hovered at her apron pocket. Mr. Carrington blinked in genuine surprise. "That's a serious accusation," Sandra finally managed. Harold nodded gravely. "Yes, and one I will see through if necessary. Either we all go back to our original seats, or I speak with the captain as Mr. Carter requested." My phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from Maxwell. Harold marched with Dr. King and argued civil rights on airplanes. Only my sister could text humor into chaos. Minutes stretched like taffy. Passengers in neighboring rows twisted around in their seats, whispers spreading behind us. "What's happening? Is it still an on-time departure? Who's going to pay for all this delay?" The plane idled, engines rumbling softly, caught between taxiway and runway. I felt a rush of purpose, anger tempered by resolve. Finally, Sandra exhaled and turned on her heel, marching toward the cockpit with Jasmine in tow. "I'll speak with the captain," she said over her shoulder. Her words were a promise of change or an admission of defeat. I wasn't sure which. Left behind, we settled back into our row. Jasmine hovered, guilt and conflict swirling in her eyes. "Can I get anyone water while we wait?" she asked quietly. "Water would be lovely," Harold replied, voice warm. "And a copy of the seating policy for my reference." As Jasmine hurried off, I watched the wheels of justice turning in real time. The engines continued to hum, but in row 16, a different power was at work. Collective dignity refusing to be bulldozed by entitlement. At last, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We're experiencing a brief administrative delay, but we'll be underway shortly. "Flight attendants, please prepare for a quick meeting in the galley." The announcement was polite, but I could almost taste the tension in every syllable. Passengers checked watches, scrolled phones, muttered about being late. But in our corner of the cabin, something had shifted. We weren't just siblings on a flight anymore. We were catalysts, ripping away polite facades and pointing out that prejudice, no matter how subtly expressed, deserves to be exposed. I caught Maxwell's eye one more time. His shoulders were squared, determination etched into every line of his face. "You okay?" I whispered. He nodded. "More than okay. It's time they understood the cost of discrimination." I smiled, pride threading through me like a lifeline. Whatever happened next, whether the plane took off or stayed grounded for hours, we had already claimed our small victory. And when we finally touched down in Atlanta, it would be on our terms, not theirs. The flight attendants' meeting in the galley felt like a trial in an old courthouse, with Sandra pacing and waving her arms while Jasmine stood by, shoulders slumped and guilt written on her face. When Jasmine returned to our row and asked Maxwell Carter, Zoe Carter, and Harold Jensen to come forward, my heart pounded in my chest. Every passenger's eyes followed us, some with curiosity, some with annoyance at the delay, and a few with sympathy that stung like salt on a fresh wound. We obeyed, walking down the aisle under the weight of whispered judgments and the buzz of idle engines. Captain David Reynolds was waiting in the narrow space just outside the cockpit door. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples and a voice that carried both authority and genuine concern. He greeted us with a firm handshake, me, Zoe, and Harold. His blue eyes met mine and held them. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Carter, Mr. Jensen," he said. "I understand there's been some confusion about seating. I'd like to hear your perspective." Maxwell squared his shoulders and spoke first. "Captain, this isn't just confusion. It's discrimination." His voice was steady but edged with anger. "My sister and I were singled out to give up seats when other solutions existed. When that failed, new reasons were invented for why we had to move again. At one point, we offered an easy fix and were still rebuffed." Zoe tapped her fingertips together, her academic precision shining through. "It followed a classic pattern of bias," she said. "First, a neutral request targeting us, then shifting justifications, then threats to call security. It was coercion dressed up as policy." The captain nodded thoughtfully and turned to Harold. "Mr. Jensen, you witnessed this?" Harold adjusted his glasses, dignity intact. "I did. I offered to switch seats to resolve it, only to see that solution canceled by the very same crew. That isn't how seating conflicts are supposed to be handled." Captain Reynolds rubbed his chin and took a breath. "The safety and dignity of every passenger is my responsibility. If discrimination occurred under my command, I must address it. I apologize on behalf of the airline. I will file a formal incident report. Now, as for today's flight, here are our options. We can continue with you in your original seats. We can rebook the Carringtons on another flight. Or if you feel uncomfortable, we can arrange alternative transportation with full compensation." I exchanged a glance with Maxwell. Our parents were waiting in Atlanta for my father's 50th wedding anniversary. "We'd like to continue as planned," I said, voice firm. "But I need assurance that no further targeting will happen." Captain Reynolds met my gaze evenly. "You have my word," he said. Then he turned to Harold. "Mr. Jensen, thank you for your intervention. Would you return to your original seat?" Harold smiled. "Happy to," he said, then winked at Zoe. "Perhaps she'll finish telling me about her work during beverage service." We returned to row 16, where Sandra stood, head bowed, explaining to Mr. and Mrs. Carrington that Mr. Carrington would resume his first-class seat and his wife would keep the aisle seat at our row, with Maxwell in the middle and Zoe at the window. As we settled back, Captain Reynolds' voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. I apologize for the delay. We'll be taking off shortly. This airline has zero tolerance for discrimination. If you witness anything contrary to this policy, Please inform a flight attendant or ask to speak with me directly. Thank you for your patience." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Some passengers nodded, a few offered apologetic smiles. I caught Jasmine's eye as she passed. She gave me a quiet, relieved nod. Ms. Carrington, now sitting beside us, stared straight ahead, her posture stiff. After a moment, she turned toward Maxwell. "I never intended discrimination," she said, voice low. Maxwell met her gaze evenly. "I understand wanting to sit with your husband," he replied. "My sister and I wanted the same." Ms. Carrington's lips trembled. "I suppose we'll be sharing this row for the rest of the flight?" "That's correct," Maxwell said. "And I promise not to lean on your armrest if you extend the same courtesy." A ghost of a smile flickered across her face. "Deal," she whispered. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Zoe leaned forward. "I noticed your wedding ring," she said, examining the vintage Art Deco band on Ms. Carrington's hand. "It's beautiful." Ms. Carrington looked down at the ring. "It belonged to my grandmother," she admitted. "I forget how much stories can live in a piece of jewelry. I researched material culture for my doctorate," Zoe said. "Jewelry reveals social values across generations." Ms. Carrington's eyebrows lifted in surprise, then softened. "That's fascinating." When we reached cruising altitude, I reached into my bag and retrieved the book Zoe gave me for Christmas, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. Ms. Carrington glanced at the cover, then quickly looked away, but not before I caught the recognition in her eyes. "Have you read it?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "My book club read it last year," she admitted. "I didn't finish." "It's long but worth it," I said. "It helped me understand the great migration my grandparents made from Mississippi to Chicago." Her shoulders eased. "My family's been in Boston for generations," she said quietly. "I forget how recent that migration was." I nodded. "They left everything familiar for a chance at opportunity. It wasn't until I was older I understood what they sacrificed." Ms. Carrington swallowed. "My husband's grandfather owned a small business in Atlanta that served black families during segregation," she said softly. Pride glimmered in her voice. "He believed healthcare shouldn't be segregated." Zoe's respect for Ms. Carrington's ancestor was clear. "That was courageous," she said. "People did what they could within unjust systems." Maxwell cleared his throat. "We're heading to Atlanta for our parents' 50th anniversary," he said. 50 years of marriage." Ms. Carrington's eyes brimmed. "That's wonderful," she said. "Richard and I just celebrated 32. I couldn't resist. "Any advice for someone not there yet?" She laughed gently. "Choose someone who makes you laugh when you're mad, and always have separate sinks if you can afford it." We all chuckled, the ice fully broken. When Jasmine returned with beverage service, she poured a glass of tomato juice for Ms. Carrington. "Thank you," Ms. Carrington said, her voice steady. "Sandra isn't a bad person. She's always been helpful, at least to me." Zoe leaned in. "Most discrimination isn't intentional. It's unconscious bias, systemic patterns. Sandra may not have set out to target us, but when she had a problem, she reached for the easiest choice." Ms. Carrington's gaze flickered to the aisle where Sandra stood talking to another attendant. "You're right," she said softly. "I owe you both an apology." Maxwell offered his hand. "Apology accepted," he said. "Now let's enjoy the flight." As the clouds rushed by outside, row 16 settled into an unlikely peace. We shared stories of grandparents and activism, of architecture and sociology, of love and laughter. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, and though we had all been matched against each other by bias and entitlement, we found understanding at 35,000 feet. When the first glow of the city lights of Atlanta appeared below, I felt a surge of triumph, not just for the resolution, but for the knowledge that dignity, once claimed, can never be taken away. That exchange felt as sharp as shattered glass when Zoe pointed out the statistics. Eleanor Carrington's lips pressed into a thin line, and her fingers gripped the armrest so hard her knuckles went white. "That's an uncharitable interpretation," she snapped. her voice cold enough to freeze the cabin air. Her eyes flicked to every face around us, as though daring someone to challenge her. Zoe didn't flinch. "My research focuses on these very interactions," she said, voice low but steady. "Data shows that minorities are asked to inconvenience themselves nearly twice as often as white passengers." Her words landed with the weight of undeniable evidence. Charts, figures, repeated patterns, forcing Eleanor to swallow. "Not everyone is a case study," Eleanor shot back, tone dripping with disdain. "We're all human beings, not numbers on a spreadsheet." She leaned forward so that her chest nearly brushed Zoe's, as though proximity could intimidate us into silence. The tension crackled in the aisle lights. "It doesn't matter if you like it," Zoe replied softly, her scholarly precision sharpened by frustration. "We're all data points in society's experiment on prejudice." The blunt honesty in her voice made Eleanor's eyes flicker with discomfort. Before the moment could turn uglier, I stepped in. "Speaking of data points," I said, "Zoe just got offered a full professorship at Emory's new Center for Racial Justice Studies." I kept my tone casual, but inside I felt a surge of pride. She might be moving back to Atlanta soon. Eleanor's posture softened. "Emory's campus is beautiful in the spring," she admitted, voice lighter. "My niece graduated from their law school last year." At those words, the ice between us cracked just a little. As the flight hummed on, a surprising shift took hold in row 16. Eleanor leaned back, sharing stories of her grandchildren's school plays and her years as a hospital administrator navigating bureaucratic health systems. I spoke about my architecture firm's latest project downtown, how I finally made partner. Zoe translated her research into vivid anecdotes, making data feel human. Halfway through the flight, Harold Jensen appeared in the aisle again, phone in hand. "Mind if I interrupt?" he asked with a grin. "I wanted to show Eleanor some new photos of my great-granddaughter." He squeezed into the tight space, phone screen glowing with images of a tiny face and bright eyes. We gathered around his phone as he swiped through snapshots. Eleanor's eyes softened at the sight of that infant smile. Harold tapped the screen thoughtfully. Today reminded me that progress isn't always linear," he said. "Sometimes we take 2 steps forward and 1 back, but the direction matters." I glanced at Zoe. "Progress?" I asked. Harold's gaze was steely. "When I was a young attorney in the 1960s, no one would have investigated a seating dispute involving black passengers. The fact that Captain Reynolds took you seriously, that is progress." Zoe nodded. "Small progress," she said. Harold's eyes crinkled with warmth. "Every big change starts small," he countered. "Like my great-granddaughter here. She's born into a world still flawed, but better than the one I entered." Eleanor studied the baby pictures and then glanced at her ring. "Her name is Sophia Elizabeth," Harold said, pride shining in his voice. "Named after my late wife." Eleanor turned her hand over, gazing at the vintage Art Deco diamond. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Zoe leaned in, genuine curiosity in her eyes. "I did my doctoral research on material culture and identity," she explained. "Jewelry often speaks volumes about social values across generations." That insight seemed to touch Eleanor. When we reached cruising altitude, I pulled out the book Zoe gave me for Christmas, The Warmth of Other Suns, by Isabel Wilkerson. Eleanor glanced at the cover. "Have you read this?" I asked. She hesitated. "My book club picked it last year," she admitted. "I didn't finish it." "It's dense," I agreed. "But it helped me understand my grandparents' journey from Mississippi to Chicago." Her shoulders eased, and she met my gaze. "My husband's grandfather ran a pharmacy in Atlanta that served black families during segregation," she said quietly. "That was courageous," Zoe said. "People did what they could within unjust systems." I added, "We're flying home for our parents' 50th wedding anniversary." Her eyes glistened. 50 years? That's remarkable," she said. Eleanor turned to Zoe. "Is that what you call an ally?" she asked. Zoe gave a small smile. "Today, absolutely," she replied. You spoke up when it was easier to stay silent. That's the definition of allyship. Eleanor looked thoughtful. I never thought of myself needing to be an ally, she confessed. Zoe met her eyes gently. That's privilege, she said. The luxury of living without checking how power and bias affect others. Eleanor bristled again. Do you teach your students to lead with accusations like that? She demanded. Zoe blinked, taken aback. It wasn't an accusation, she said softly. It was an observation. Silence settled between them, heavier than any seating conflict. Captain Reynolds's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to Atlanta. The weather is a pleasant 78 degrees Fahrenheit with clear skies. I want to thank you for your patience and remind you this airline has zero tolerance for discrimination. If you witness anything, please let a flight attendant know or ask to speak with me directly. As the wheels touched the runway and the cabin lights brightened, Eleanor turned to me and Zoe. I want to apologize, she said, voice sincere. Not just about the seating, but my attitude today. I reached out. We all have bad days, I said. Zoe added, reflect, learn, and try to do better next time. She nodded, rubbing her thumb over the diamond in her ring. Richard and I had a huge argument this morning, she confessed. I boarded upset. I offered a gentle smile. Most people's bad days don't include inconveniencing strangers, she said, echoing Zoe's words about systems and bias. I have some reflection to do. As passengers gathered bags and stretched, Eleanor's phone buzzed. Richard's at baggage claim, she said with a shy smile. Are your parents meeting you? Zoe asked. Yes, I replied. They're excited to see us. Eleanor looked at Zoe and me with genuine warmth. I hope your anniversary celebration is wonderful, she said. Zoe's eyes softened. Thank you, she whispered. In that moment, row 16 felt strangely transformed. We hadn't erased decades of injustice, but we'd reached something deeper, a shared recognition of each other's humanity. And as we stepped off the plane into Atlanta's warm spring air, I knew none of us would forget the journey it took to get there. As Maxwell Carter and Zoe Carter stepped onto the jet bridge, Sandra stood at the door, offering a polite thank you and goodbye to every passenger. Maxwell paused and called out so everyone could hear. I appreciate the apology Captain Reynolds provided, he said, steady but loud enough for all to hear. I also want to announce that the airline will compensate every passenger in row 16 for this delay and mistreatment. Maxwell held up his phone, playing the recording of Sandra's initial demand that they move because of the color of their skin. The passengers gathered around, murmuring as they heard Sandra's voice insisting she had no choice but to inconvenience black travelers. Sandra's professional mask cracked and her eyes filled with shame. Moments later, Captain Reynolds hurried down the jet bridge, reaching Sandra's side. Effective immediately, he announced, she is suspended pending a full investigation. The crowd burst into applause, a wave of satisfaction rolling down the line. Sandra's shoulders slumped as tears welled in her eyes. As the applause faded, Sandra stood frozen, the weight of public exposure heavy on her. Zoe caught Maxwell's eye and saw both triumph and pity there. They had forced accountability, but they also felt sorrow for a colleague whose prejudice had betrayed her. Outside, Harold Jensen waited with his cane. He tipped his hat and said with a grin, "Have you seen social media? The hashtag Justice for Carters is trending nationwide. Your bravery turned a simple flight into a call for real change." Ahead in the terminal, Mr. Carter and Mrs. Carter held up a handmade sign reading, "Welcome home, our pride and joy." Maxwell's throat tightened as he linked arms with Zoe and Harold. They embraced under the bright airport lights. As they walked toward the parking garage, Maxwell invited Harold to their parents' 50th anniversary celebration that Saturday evening. Harold's eyes twinkled and he accepted. Driving off into the warm Atlanta sunshine, Maxwell reflected that today's stand was more than a single victory. It was proof that even small acts of resistance can spark lasting progress and resilient hope.